Welcome everyone to another edition of Play It Through, and on this edition it's Dynowarz, the Destruction of Spondylus, brought to us by Bandai. Interestingly enough, Dynowarz was actually only released in the North American market. In Dynowarz, we're playing as Professor Proteus, and he is in the Spondylus solar system. Basically, it is made up of several different planets that all have a computer that basically works as the computer's central life support. In the game, you're traveling from planet to planet to fix a virus that has somehow spread to all the various different computers. So here we go with Dynowarz for the NES. When we start up, you can go to a password screen to put in and get back to a level you may have already gotten to, or just start a brand new game, in which case you're dropped right into the game. There are no real cutscenes or storyline, just some minor scenes in between when you're transitioning from your human form into the dino form, when you're getting into the giant dinosaur mech. You start off by playing as Professor Proteus, and there's two different styles of gameplay in Dynowarz. You have these on-ground areas where you're playing as Professor Proteus, and then you're jumping into the giant Robosaur known as Cyborosaurus. When you make it to the end of the opening area, you then jump into that giant mech and start riding around in Cyborosaurus. Now things are changed up a little bit. If you're familiar with Godzilla for the NES, it's similar to that in the way that Cyborosaurus ends up controlling. For the most part, though, you can end up jumping past and skipping a lot of the enemies, especially early on, because you do have a large amount of health. But be mindful, your health does not regenerate between the stages. You start off with a very, very poor attack as the dinosaur. As you can see, you have a very, very small punch. But there are several other weapons that you can pick up by destroying enemies. Defeating certain enemies will cause them to drop items. When you pick up a weapon, you'll start off as level 1, but you can actually upgrade your weapons up to level 3. Though we will only be picking up one particular weapon and keeping a hold of that, because honestly, most of the weapons in the game are quite poor. When you make it to the end of an area with Cyborosaurus, you'll have to battle a boss near a gate. For the first boss, we're just going to be attacking him several times, and you can notice that every time you attack him, he ends up speeding past you a little bit. Just keep attacking him a few times until he explodes, in which case he'll drop a key, allowing us to go inside the next area as Professor Proteus, which is the location of the life support computer. The game checkpoints you at the beginning of each of these styles of areas, so if you end up dying and you unfortunately only have one life, you do start back off at the beginning of one of these areas. Go right several screens till you find a giant computer, in which case you'll crouch right on the edge of the screen and just keep firing until you're able to destroy the life support virus that's sitting in the computer. Once you've done so, you do have to backtrack. And once you backtrack, you'll jump back into the dinosaur, in which case you'll be back outside, and you just have to go to the teleporter, which is located to the right of the gate. We're now in level 2. And you may have noticed, of course, I went by all that pretty quickly. The thing about this game, though, is it's one of the most straightforward NES games that I've played in a long time. There's really no mazes or anything to kind of get you sidetracked. It's just a straight left to right path, go inside the machine, fight the virus, and then backtrack to the robot, use the teleporter, and blast off. And you do this for 7 levels. Now, enemies do change up. For example, you'll get these pterodactyls that start appearing. The pterodactyls, while annoying to try to actually do damage to, because they don't really fly at you directly, when you end up hitting them, they then fly straight forward. So for example, if they're up in the air and they're trying to come down towards you, when you deliver a hit, they're then going to dash forward. They won't dash forward until you end up delivering a hit. You may have noticed I did pick up our first weapon of the game, the fireballs, and this is the weapon we're going to be using throughout the game. The fireballs is the only weapon that is a straight forward shot. It's a little bit difficult to tell what each of the weapons are. They're not like labeled with letters like a lot of other games, or have really distinct symbols when they end up dropping to the ground. They do all look a little bit different, but you'll notice they're all blue and they kind of resemble one another, so sometimes it can be difficult to tell which weapon you're actually picking up. After destroying the Stegosaurus robot, I've now picked up the third of my upgrades for the fireballs, so I'm going to keep this throughout the course of the game, as this is pretty much the best weapon. You get a straightforward shot, as well as two other shots in a spread direction. The other weapons, the ones I'm not going to be using, one of which is the beam, which is the second best weapon, at least as far as I'm concerned. It fires a straightforward beam, and it gets little fireball shots along with it. It can go through some objects, but it seems to be a little bit weaker against some of the enemies, so I still stick with the fireball. The ones I definitely will never really use is the launch fist, which is actually a fist that will come out of the robot, basically your hand, and it goes forward and then comes back to you like a boomerang. The problem is, once it launches out, you're completely vulnerable, and a lot of enemies do get quite close to you. Then you have the bomb, which you pretty much just lob a grenade-like bomb, and overall ends up missing a lot of enemies. Now for the pterodactyl I mentioned earlier, basically you want him to come down just a little bit, then we're going to jump in the air and launch one of our fireball shots at him in order to launch him straight forward across the screen, and we're going to do our best to try to get him stuck this way. After defeating him, we'll grab the key and move inside. Now, there are several rematches against these bosses, so we'll have more time to battle them. For the second virus computer, just like the first one, we're going to get to the very edge and start firing. Now, once in a while, you will have a projectile come your way. You may have to back up a little bit, but staying on this very edge is a pretty safe bet in order to destroy the virus inside the computer. The hardest part about the Proteus parts is actually traveling, jumping from the platform to platform. Those moving platform segments, especially the ones we're going to be doing later on in the game, are quite difficult. The exact timing takes a long time to get used to, so practice it a bit, especially early on in the game when you first start booting up. The rooms are very similar to one another, no matter what level you're at, so practicing a room with the moving platforms early on will actually benefit you later on. Once you destroy the virus in the computer, you may have noticed all the other enemies that were scattered throughout that whole area are destroyed, so you can easily, safely make it back. One thing I haven't mentioned yet is there's two types of health in the game. You have your energy, which is your core health, and you have a barrier that you can pick up by picking up a B icon. The B icons are usually dropped from the pterodactyl enemies, making them one of the best enemies in the game to actually battle. So anytime you see one of those guys, definitely want to attack them, because they'll usually either drop health, or they'll end up dropping barrier. Most strategy, as far as enemies go in the game, is just firing at them. There's not a whole lot of dodging that you can really do a lot in the game. A lot of enemies are really close to the ground, making them a little bit difficult to hit. That's why I like using the fireball, as it gives me a good opportunity to hit them. And a lot of the other bigger enemies take multiple shots with the fireballs, and they just get backed up a little bit. The weird ones are the ones that you hit, and then they kind of charge forward, going into your body, and you keep hitting them over and over again. They'll just keep running back and forth. If you time the hits correctly on a lot of these guys, you'll be able to keep hitting them without them doing damage to you. But if they end up running past me, I usually just forget about them and just run past them and go to the next screen. Since there is a decent amount of health drops from enemies in the game, health isn't too scarce. Over here to the far right, we battle the third of the robots, destroy it, and pick up the key in order to enter inside the next area. These segments are, like I said, the tougher part of the game. The parts with the Cyborosaurus are much, much easier. You can take shortcuts on the spikes. Sometimes it's actually more beneficial to do so. Obviously, you're going to take a little bit of damage, but if you jump quickly, you'll only take one hit from the spikes, which does very minimal damage overall, especially considering, in a lot of games, of course, spikes end up doing either a ton of damage or end up killing you right out. Once again, for the virus room, we're going to walk over to the edge here and just keep firing at the computer. If you get really close to the edge, you have to be very careful, like I was there. I ended up actually falling off the edge when I stood back up, but thankfully I was able to kind of clip that very edge and still be able to get back up. The game is pretty lenient when it comes to that. Backtracking, I will use the platforms just to keep my health up, I guess, and move on to level 4 once I finally make it all the way over. By the time you've made it to level 4, you pretty much have a good grasp of how the game works. There really isn't too much more added to it. There are a couple of more enemy types, but with the powered up fireball ability, I'm able to take out a lot of enemies, even the flying pterodactyls in a single hit. The other ones that take a lot of hits, I usually just end up walking past, unless I really have to deal with them near, like, pits. Pits are still very deadly. If you fall into a pit, it's an instant game over. But like I said, thankfully, you do start off at the beginning of the previous area. So you'll start off at the beginning of the Cyborosaurus area, or if you're in the Proteus area, you'll start off at the beginning of that. Here I take a hit to the Stegosaurus, get him to move forward some, and then when I walk on the spikes, I'm able to just walk on past. I knew there's another pterodactyl that was coming up, and either was going to give me health, or would have ended up giving me barrier, which, of course, barrier is more beneficial, but overall, as long as I have full health, I have plenty of health in order to help me get through the rest of the area. I always have to be very cautious, though, that I don't end up picking up one of the weapons that I don't want. Of course, one of the negative things is if you have a level 3 weapon and you pick up another weapon, it goes down, of course, to level 1 for that next weapon, and you'll have to upgrade that. So, it's best just to pick whatever weapon that you particularly like and stick with that one. Hit detection overall in this game is pretty poor at times, so that's why it's a good thing that the game gives you so much health in order to help you out. Also be very careful when you see those blue objects that just kind of look like little circles on the ground are the landmines, and they do a pretty decent amount of damage to you, but since they kind of look like everything else as far as the weapons and other pickups being the same color as them, it can be a little bit deceptive, but always be on the lookout and make sure you don't end up landing on one of the landmines. Over here we have another one of the pterodactyls. I'm going to jump up into the air in order to cause him to move forward. Just keep bouncing him back and forth until eventually he'll give up and kind of just fly back to the right. I can hit him one more time, defeat him, and then move inside of the Stage 4 planet's base. This first room is a real problem, as it's really hard to kind of move between all these platforms. There's a lot of guys here. I recommend taking out the up and down moving enemies before attempting to make those jumps. Don't concern yourself too much with the wall turrets. They will probably end up hitting you, and they're really difficult to actually keep hitting. Jump along these platforms and make a jump over to the far right. Now in here, you're going to have a different style of the virus room. We're going to stand right here at the top of these stairs, every so often standing up, making sure that we can't get hit by any of the enemies. And then once you've defeated the other enemies in the room, you can just stand there and keep firing. The virus computer won't be able to actually hit you if you stand on that particular stair. So just keep firing at him until it's defeated, and then work your way back to the Cyborosaurus. One of the other things that you can get from time to time is the bomb, which you can see is located in the top center of the screen, which will do damage and destroy all the enemies currently on the screen. But since it's so pretty much easy to take out a lot of enemies, I usually don't even bother with it. You'll also notice that enemies that were some of the tougher ones, or like the boss-style enemies in earlier levels, become kind of common enemies, like the giant version of the pterodactyls that we're seeing now here. The good thing is they also still drop the energy and barrier like their other counterparts, so it's pretty easy to deal with them. I mentioned it earlier, but still one of the hardest things to kind of just deal with because the jumping is very clunky, especially in your Cyborosaurus form, let alone in the human form. It's also pretty tough. But watching out for those pits, making sure that you don't end up falling down them is probably the biggest hazard that you're going to have to deal with. The barriers are also, of course, one of the best items to pick up just because that extra bar of health is extremely useful in the game. At the end of the segment, we have another giant pterodactyl, who we've already been kind of fighting those throughout the whole level, so it's kind of a lame boss for the end of this particular stage. But once he's done, we're back inside the next base. Now, in Proteus form, you can still pick up Energy Barrier, but you'll also see the P item drop, and this is your power-up for your weapon, allowing you to actually fire your gun multiple times depending upon what level it is. Like you can see, I have level 2 gun at the moment. If I'm able to get another one, it will level up to 3, but even at 1, you still have plenty of firepower. Now for this one, it's a little bit tougher to dodge not getting hit, so I usually just stand here on the edge. As long as I have a decent amount of health, I'm able to just keep firing at the top of the staircase and just keep firing right at the virus, and he'll go down pretty quickly. He will be able to hit me. Now you can try to dodge and jump over him and all the different fire that's going on in the room, but honestly I find it quicker and actually lose less health if I just go up and just start firing at him completely. Now we're on to stage number 6, and we have only 2 more levels left to go. I get lucky, I'm able to take out a pterodactyl at the very beginning of the area and be able to get a full barrier. Getting a full barrier at the beginning of the level will pretty much allow me to run through a large amount of the enemies if I choose to, of course. While level number 6 is an ice-themed level from what you can see, it doesn't change up really anything. You're not slipping and sliding like you would in most ice-themed stages in games. As long as you're able to make it over some of the pits throughout the level, and there's a good amount, especially in this whole cave area, so be very cautious. But because enemies can't knock you back into the pits, the biggest hassle is if you're trying to make a jump and get hit in midair, you're more than likely gonna end up falling down. At the end here, in order to face this large boss, just wait till it finally, slowly crawls its way on screen. As you're firing at it, when you notice it take a little jump back, then you know you're actually doing damage to it. Just stand still and keep firing at it until it's taken down and move inside for the base of stage number 6. At this point, you've seen most of the rooms that the game has to offer as far as the bases go, but there are a couple of new ones that will spring up. For example, this room right here is a little bit more difficult. I recommend kind of taking out the mine before trying to jump over that turret that's on the ground there. It's a little bit annoying, but you should be able to hit it as you're jumping through. Now, when you make it into this room, take out the enemies from a distance, then jump to the individual platforms. That's why I really never worry about leveling up my weapon all that much, because it's much more important that I actually make my jumps instead of trying to chase down like the various power upgrades. In the next room, you can either jump across the spikes or just take the up and down moving platforms. You probably noticed that there's quite a few rooms in this particular base, and the final base has even more. When you make it to the end of the area, though, start off by taking out the flying guys overhead if you want to conserve some health, but eventually you're just going to be ducking down on the edge like we have for a lot of the earlier types of these virus rooms, and then the part where we just have to kind of backtrack our way, so be very cautious, of course. Make all your jumps with precision so that you don't have to redo any of this. In a room like this, of course, you can take the upper path. It'll be a lot more safer, but usually it's a little bit quicker to take the bottom. Sometimes, though, when I make that one jump, I'm able to land on top of the platform. Usually when you're going the other way, there's enemies up there, there's turrets, so it's a little bit harder to try to jump straight up to that top platform. After making it back to the beginning and going up into space once again, we move on to the 7th and final stage of Dynowarz. Just like all the previous levels, nothing really has changed up. There may be a few more enemies than usual, but overall, if you've been able to get through all the previous stages, this level should be no different. Always take out the pterodactyls like we've been doing the entire game, because they always have the potential for dropping either health or, of course, a barrier. Take your time. We're going to take out this robot before jumping up to the platform. I'm always, of course, doing my best to avoid any of the unnecessary weapon upgrades. Like normal, though, there's some spikes throughout. You can either walk right on top of them. They thankfully really don't damage you that much. Or you can, of course, try to do the little jumps over them. Since hit detection is a little bit wonky, sometimes even when you make a jump over spikes in the game, you still end up just barely clipping them and taking that little bit of damage. So I guess it's a good thing that they really don't damage you all that much. The boss for this section is another one of the types of dinosaurs we just battled at the end of level 6 as well. Sometimes he'll jump towards you, but once you start seeing you're knocking him back with your hits, you can just kind of stand still. He seems to jump a lot more than some of the other ones, including sometimes jumping over your head back and forth. And when he does this, sometimes he'll just clear you completely so you won't even really take damage. And even if he runs into you, he only does a very, very small minimum amount of damage. Now it's time for the final base of the game. Of course, being the final base, they're going to give you some pretty tricky platforming to do. The enemies, not tough. The final thing at the end, the virus computer, not tough. But the platforming, definitely a little bit challenging. This room in particular is a little bit difficult. I recommend taking out the enemies that are flying all around, just so you have a clearer view of your platform so that you can make the jumps a little bit more safely. Now in this room you don't have any moving platforms on the bottom, so you're going to have to take the upper path. Usually I just avoid even fighting the guys there and just keep jumping over them and just run to the opposite side, because it can sometimes be actually difficult to hit those auto turrets that are attached to that upper platform. Here's another example of take out a couple enemies if you can before attempting to make it to the jumps. With so much flying around, it can sometimes be difficult to even see exactly where the platform is. In the virus room, what we're going to do is going to stand on this platform and then take out the turret on the right side. Then you're going to want to duck down on this platform, the one moving, and keep firing. Because the platform you're sitting on is moving, you'll actually be able to avoid some of the fire from the other weapons and enemies that are scattered throughout the room, and you can keep firing at the computer until it's destroyed. Now that is the final boss of the game. There isn't another boss afterwards, but we do have to backtrack our way all the way throughout the final base and back to the dinosaur just like we have on all the previous stages. When you make it back to the dinosaur, you jump inside and go up the warp like normal and can sit back and enjoy the ending to Dynowarz. Overall, I have to say, Dynowarz is just a weird game. It's not necessarily one of the worst games for the NES, but it definitely has some bad things going for it. Some repetitive levels, the hit detection is quite poor at times, as well as just some overall mediocre music and mediocre weapons to kind of help you out, making Dynowarz honestly just forgettable. And just being such a cool concept of playing as a giant mech dinosaur on the NES should be a really cool game, so that's another reason why Dynowarz always was kind of a letdown for me. But anyway guys, that will wrap up this edition of Play It Through. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, consider giving it a thumbs up or commenting down below. If you enjoyed this futuristic dinosaur adventure, maybe you'll enjoy a more prehistoric one in Joe and Mac for the NES. You can check it out by clicking my video over on the right side of the screen. Of course, I also need to thank all the members of my Patreon. Your guys' continued support is keeping this channel alive. As little as $1 a month can really help out. And you can help out by just clicking the little Patreon link down below. And of course, besides getting your name here, there's also some other cool incentives as well. Now guys, thank you so much for watching, and of course, I hope you enjoyed.